I inherited $400,000 from a man I barely knew. One night, I offered a drink to a lonely old stranger in a bar. 2 months later, he was gone and left me everything he had. His family hated me for it. They tried to take it back. But what I did next wasn't about the money at all. It was a Thursday evening when I walked into O'Malley's, the kind of bar where time seemed to stand still. Faded wood paneling, sticky floors. A jukebox in the corner that hadn't changed its playlist since the 90s. I hadn't planned to be there. I just needed a drink after a long, grinding week. I ordered a whiskey neat and leaned against the bar, letting the low hum of conversation and distant clinking of glasses numb my thoughts. That's when I noticed him, an older man, sitting 2 stools down, nursing a drink like it was the only thing keeping him alive. He wasn't drunk. Not yet. His clothes were clean, his jacket pressed, but his face looked like it carried too many stories nobody wanted to hear. I don't know what made me speak to him. Maybe it was the way he stared into his glass like it held all the answers he'd never gotten. Maybe it was the loneliness rolling off him in waves. "Rough day?" I asked. He gave a half-hearted chuckle, deep and dry. "Rough life," he muttered. Something about that answer made me pause. Most people would have shrugged it off, maybe offered a sympathetic nod, and gone back to pretending not to care. But I stayed. We sat in silence for a while. 2 strangers connected by nothing more than a shared moment of weariness. After a few minutes, I asked, "You doing all right?" He glanced at me, his eyes sharp but tired. "No, son," he said simply. "I'm dying. Stage 4. A month, maybe less." There was no drama in his voice. No fishing for pity. Just a man stating a fact the way you might comment on the weather. I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, feeling how empty the word sounded. "Not your fault," he said. Then after a beat, he added, "Hell, you're the first person who's even asked." He went quiet again, and I thought that might be the end of it. But then he started to talk. Slowly at first, then faster, like he was uncorking years of bottled-up anger and sorrow. He told me about his family, kids and grandkids who barely remembered he existed unless they needed something, about birthdays forgotten, holidays spent alone, how the only calls he got these days were from creditors or telemarketers. "They don't even know I'm sick," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "And if they did, wouldn't change a damn thing." I listened, really listened, not out of obligation, but because it felt like someone had to. When the bartender called last call, I realized we'd been sitting there for hours. The old man, he told me his name was Walter, could barely stand. He tried to wave me off, muttering that he'd just grab a cab. But something deep inside me, something stubborn and stupid, wouldn't let me leave him there alone. "My place isn't far," I said. "Crash on the couch. Tomorrow we'll figure something out." He hesitated. Pride fought with exhaustion in his eyes. But eventually he nodded. That night, while Walter slept fitfully in my living room, I sat awake at my kitchen table, sipping cold coffee, thinking about how strange life could be. 2 hours earlier, I was just another tired nobody with a whiskey habit and too many regrets. Now I had a dying man snoring on my couch, and no idea what tomorrow was going to look like. All I knew was, somehow, I was responsible for him now. And deep down, I didn't mind. Not one bit. The morning sunlight poured into the living room, catching the dust motes dancing lazily through the air. I sat at the kitchen counter, nursing my second cup of coffee, and listened to the uneven sounds of Walter waking up. Coughing fits, groans of protest, the clumsy shuffle of feet against hardwood floors. When he finally appeared, he looked even worse than the night before. His skin was pale, almost gray under morning light, and his eyes were bloodshot and hollow. "Coffee?" I asked, lifting the pot. Walter rubbed his face, as if trying to erase the weight of decades from it. "God, yes." I poured him a cup and slid it across the counter. He accepted it with a nod of gratitude, wrapping both hands around the mug like it was a lifeline. For a while we didn't speak. The quiet was heavy but not uncomfortable. He sipped his coffee and stared out the window like he was seeing something 1,000 miles away. "You don't have to babysit me, you know," he said eventually, without looking at me. Wasn't planning to, I replied casually, "Just figured you could use a decent cup of coffee." He gave a dry chuckle. "You make a habit of dragging dying strangers into your home?" "Only the ones who look like they could use a friend," I said. That made him pause. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. I didn't flinch. "You're a strange kid," he muttered, shaking his head. "World could use a few more of you." I didn't know what to say to that. So instead, I asked, "You ever think about getting a second opinion? About the cancer, I mean." He shrugged. "Doctor all the same. Seen enough hospitals to last me 2 lifetimes." Still, I said, "Can't hurt." He didn't argue, which, in hindsight, was probably his way of agreeing. We finished our coffee, and before either of us could talk ourselves out of it, I drove him to the local hospital. He sat slumped in the passenger seat, coughing into his sleeve, while I navigated through the morning traffic. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights seemed to bleach even more color from his face. I filled out the paperwork, while Walter stared blankly at the walls. He hated being here, I could tell. Every beep, every intercom call, every glimpse of someone in a white coat seemed to suck a little more life out of him. While we waited for the doctor, he told me about his life. How he'd worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to put food on the table. How he'd sacrificed vacations, hobbies, everything, just so his kids could have a better life. How he'd assumed, stupidly, he said, that all that effort would buy him some loyalty, some respect. Instead, they grew up, moved away, and barely looked back. Birthday cards stopped coming. Calls were rare, short, and always about money. "Family," he said bitterly, "ain't about blood. It's about who shows up when it matters." I didn't know what to say, because he was right, and because I wasn't sure anyone had ever said something that true to me before. When the doctor finally came in, it didn't take long for reality to reassert itself. Stage 4, aggressive, options limited, palliative care recommended. Walter just nodded like he already knew all of it. Maybe he had. When we left the hospital, he was quiet. We drove in silence, the city blurring past in streaks of gray and brown. At a stoplight, I glanced over at him. "You hungry?" I asked. He shrugged. "Haven't had real food in a while." "There's this place I know," I said. "Best burgers in the city." He didn't argue. That felt like a victory. We pulled into a small diner off the beaten path. One of those places with faded booths and sticky menus, but food that could heal your soul. We ordered 2 bacon cheeseburgers, 2 plates of fries, and 2 beers, even though it was barely noon. For the first time, Walter smiled. It was small, tentative, like he had forgotten how. We ate in companionable silence, and for a little while, it felt almost normal. 2 guys sharing a meal, no cancer, no death sentences, no broken families. Just life, messy and fleeting as it was. When we got back to my place, he surprised me. "You got a couch?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Same one you crashed on last night." He shook his head. "I mean, you got a couch where a man can sit and tell stories without feeling like he's wasting his breath?" I smiled. "Yeah, I got one of those." Walter dropped into the couch with a heavy sigh and started talking again. Not about his family this time, but about his life. About the girl he almost married before she moved away. About the beat-up Chevy he loved more than he should have. About the fishing trips he took by himself when the loneliness got too thick. And I listened, because someone had to. The next few days slipped into a quiet, strange kind of rhythm. Every morning, I brewed 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Walter would shuffle into the kitchen around 10, grumbling about his back, his knees, the taste of hospital food still haunting his tongue. I'd just hand him the mug without a word, and he'd grunt his thanks like it was the most natural thing in the world. We didn't talk much in the mornings. It was an unspoken agreement. Morning was for breathing, for being alive, even if the clock was ticking down. Afternoons were different. Sometimes we'd go for drives, no destination in mind, just chasing the sundown winding roads that cut through fields and woods and forgotten parts of the city. He'd point out old diners he remembered, parks where he used to take his kids before they stopped caring. Every once in a while, he let slip a piece of his heart, like a man tossing pennies into a dry fountain that used to grant wishes. Other days, we stayed close to home. played cards, watched bad TV, made fun of cooking shows neither of us could cook from. It was simple, it was honest, and it felt important. Walter started looking a little better too. Not physically. The disease was doing its work, stealing him slowly. But there was something in his face, a loosening of the years he'd worn like shackles. His laugh, when it came, was rough and broken, but it was real. I found myself wanting to make him laugh more often. One evening, after a lazy day of watching old westerns, Walter cracked open a beer and leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "You ever wonder why you did it?" he asked. "Did what?" "Decided to haul some dying old man off a bar stool instead of letting him rot there." I shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. He snorted. "No such thing as seemed. You either got a good heart or you don't. Most people would have walked right past me." He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I was real close to ending it that night, you know. Had it all planned out." I froze. My stomach twisted. "But then you sat down," he continued, voice casual, like he was talking about the weather. Didn't try to save me. Didn't pity me. Just listened. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to argue, tell him he was wrong, that it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal. I saw it in his eyes. "You're a good man," he said finally. "Don't ever let the world beat that out of you." I swallowed hard, nodding once. There wasn't a damn thing I could say that would mean more than that. Later that night, after Walter had fallen asleep snoring on the couch, I sat out on the back porch alone, the cool air brushing against my face. I thought about everything he said, about how easy it was to go through life never seeing people, about how many times I'd probably walked past someone like Walter without even realizing it, and about how sometimes the smallest choices could change everything. He didn't have much time left. I knew that. He knew that. But maybe, just maybe, we could make what was left count. The stars overhead shimmered cold and distant, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Tomorrow, I decided we'd go to the beach. He mentioned once that he hadn't seen the drive to the coast took longer than I was going to fix that. Walter sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, a faded baseball cap pulled low over his thinning hair. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. I could feel the quiet anticipation coming off him like heat from a sun-warmed stone. It was a Thursday, mid-morning. The highways were mostly empty, except for a few trucks hauling goods and an occasional beat-up sedan full of tourists chasing a weekend that hadn't started yet. I rolled the windows down and let the salty air flood the car, mixing with the faint scent of Walter's aftershave and the ever-present hospital smell clinging to his clothes. "You sure you're up for this?" I asked, glancing at him. He gave a short laugh that turned into a cough. "If I die by the ocean, it'll be a hell of a better ending than a damn hospital bed." Fair enough. We hit the bridge that crossed into the coastline town, a sleepy little place with peeling paint on the storefronts and hand-painted signs advertising homemade fudge and fresh shrimp. Walter watched it all pass by like a man drinking in his last sights of the world. When we finally pulled up to the beach, the sun was high and blinding. The sand looked almost white, the ocean a deep, endless blue beyond it. Walter didn't wait for me. He opened the door and stepped out, his movements slow but determined. I grabbed a blanket from the back seat and followed him. We didn't walk far. He didn't have it in him, but we made it to a good spot where the waves kissed the shore with lazy, foamy licks. I spread the blanket out, and we sat. He stared at the water for a long time, his eyes glassy. "You know," he said after a while, his voice low, "when I was a kid, I thought the ocean could fix anything. Broken hearts, broken bones, didn't matter. You just had to let it wash over you." I smiled a little. "Maybe it still can." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe for some folks, not for an old bastard like me." We sat in silence, letting the breeze do the talking. Families milled around us. Kids building crooked sandcastles, couples strolling hand in hand, old fishermen casting lines into the surf. Life going on all around us, indifferent to one man's approaching end. Walter pulled something from his pocket. A battered old photograph, edges soft from years of handling. "That's Mary," he said, showing me the picture. A younger version of him stood next to a woman with wild dark hair and a defiant smile. They looked happy. Recklessly, beautifully happy. She was my wife, he said, back before the world got complicated. What happened? He shrugged. Same thing that happens to most people, I guess. Life, bills, kids, hurt feelings we never talked about. Regret stacked up like unpaid debts. I didn't press. He wasn't telling me for sympathy. He was just remembering out loud. After a while, Walter lay back against a blanket, folding his hands over his chest. You think about dying much? He asked, eyes closed. I hesitated. Not really. You will, he said. One day, it'll sneak up on you, and you'll wonder where all the time went. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. I just sat with him, staring out at the endless blue horizon. He dozed off eventually, the warm sun lulling him into a light, raspy-sounding sleep. I stayed by his side, watching over him like some awkward guardian angel, and I realized something sitting there. This man had no one, no wife anymore, no kids who cared, no friends who stuck around. He had me, a guy he met by accident on a random night fueled by bad luck and whiskey. The thought made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. When he woke, the sun was already dipping low, staining the sky orange and pink. Beautiful, he said hoarsely, struggling to sit up. I helped him. One last sunset, he added with a wink. Plenty more where that came from, I said, though we both knew better. We sat there until the stars started poking through the darkening sky, until the cold crept into our bones. Only then did we gather our things and shuffle back to the car. Walter fell asleep almost instantly once I started driving. I stole glances at him as the miles rolled by. His face softened in sleep, no bitterness, no regret. Just a man who had given everything he had to a world that hadn't given much back. I promised myself right then that he wouldn't leave it all behind unnoticed. Not if I could help it. Because some people deserve to be remembered for how they lived, not how they died. And Walter? He was one of those people. Walter passed away quietly one rainy Thursday morning. I was sitting beside him, half dozing in a stiff hospital chair when the monitors flatlined in a soft, almost apologetic sound. The nurses moved quickly but gently. They didn't need to tell me. I already knew. He was gone. The funeral was small. No choirs, no elaborate eulogies. Just a handful of people standing around a plain wooden casket at a windswept cemetery on the edge of town. His family was there, of course. 2 sons and a daughter, their faces pulled tight like badly worn masks. They looked uncomfortable, impatient, like this whole thing was just another chore to cross off their to-do lists. None of them approached me. They barely even looked at me. I watched from a few steps away as they huddled together, whispering in sharp, low tones, checking their watches, sighing when the priest's words dragged on too long. Not one tear shed, not even a real moment of silence. It made me angrier than I expected, but I kept it buried, deep down where it wouldn't show. When it was over, I turned to leave, figuring that was the end of my strange little chapter with Walter, until a lawyer approached me in the parking lot, umbrella tucked under his arm. "Mr. Blake, right?" he asked. "Yeah. I'm Edward Langston. I represent Mr. Walter's estate." He glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure we weren't overheard. "There's a reading of the schedule for Monday. You're listed as a party of interest." I blinked. "Me? Are you sure?" He smiled thinly. "Very sure." I didn't know what to say. I barely knew the man 2 months ago. What could he possibly leave to me? Still, when Monday rolled around, curiosity got the better of me. I put on my only decent suit, combed my hair back, and made my way to the lawyer's office. A narrow building downtown that smelled faintly of dust and old books. Walter's family was already there when I arrived. His eldest son, a thick-necked, red-faced man named Greg, sneered at me the second I walked through the door. His daughter, Lynn, twisted her designer purse in her lap, like she was trying to strangle it. The youngest, Jason, looked me up and down with open disgust. "What the hell are you doing here?" Greg barked, not even bothering with a hello. I was invited. I said evenly. Invited. Jason laughed bitterly. This is for family, buddy, not whatever you are. I opened my mouth to reply, but Mr. Langston interrupted. Shall we get started? He said briskly, motioning us all to sit. The conference room was cold and sterile. A long mahogany table dominated the center, a stack of folders neatly arranged at one end. Mr. Langston opened a top file and cleared his throat. I'll make this brief, he said. Walter James Carver left specific, legally binding instructions regarding the distribution of his estate. He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone squirm. To his biological children, Greg, Lynn, and Jason, Mr. Carver bequeaths his personal effects, a 1988 Ford pickup truck, and a photo album containing family memories. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. And to Mr. Blake Carter, Langston continued smoothly, nodding toward me. Mr. Carver leaves a remainder of his estate, including all monetary assets totaling approximately $400,000. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, what? Greg exploded, slamming his fists onto the table hard enough to rattle the folders. This is bullshit. Jason snarled, shooting to his feet. He didn't even know this guy. He must have manipulated him, tricked him when he was sick. Lynn just sat there, mouth working silently like a fish gasping on dry land. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't even dared to think it was possible. Mr. Langston continued unfazed, like he'd seen this kind of meltdown 100 times before. All documents have been notarized, witnessed, and verified, he said crisply. Any attempt to contest a will are unlikely to succeed. Greg pointed a trembling finger at me. You're going to regret this, he hissed. Mark my words. I didn't say a damn thing. I didn't have to, because at that moment, sitting there while they seethed and sputtered, I understood something Walter must have known long before he died. Family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty, respect, decency, things these people had long since thrown away. They didn't deserve his kindness. They didn't deserve a cent of what he left behind. But me, for reasons I might never fully understand, Walter decided I did. And I wasn't about to let him down. The phone calls started the very next day. At first, they were just missed calls from unknown numbers. Then came the voicemails, snarling voices dripping with anger, thinly veiled threats wrapped in clumsy legal jargon. You think you can just steal what's ours? You're going to pay for this. Enjoy the money while you can, thief. We'll see you in court. I ignored the first few. Then the text started. Messages filled with barely concealed malice. You don't know who you're messing with. You'll wish you never met him. You better watch your back. It would have been almost laughable if it wasn't so pathetic. These were the same people who couldn't even be bothered to sit through their own father's funeral without checking their watches. Now they were desperate enough to lash out in any direction, hoping something would stick. By the end of the week, they had officially filed a lawsuit against me, claiming undue influence, emotional manipulation, and financial abuse of an elderly man. When I read the filing, I actually laughed. I had every receipt, every medical bill, every credit card statement showing that I'd paid for Walter's treatments, his comfort, his last memories. Not a penny of it was spent on myself. The paper trail was ironclad. Still, I wasn't stupid. I hired the best lawyer I could find, a sharp, brutal woman named Dana Reeves who had the reputation of making opposing counsel cry in depositions. When I handed her the stack of documents, she skimmed them quickly, then looked up at me with a small, dangerous smile. This will be fun, she said. But just because the case was airtight didn't mean the war was over. Greg showed up outside my house once, standing on the sidewalk like some half-baked vigilante, arms crossed over his broad chest. He didn't say anything, just stared, for almost an hour. It was childish intimidation, but it still put a knot in my gut. I started locking all my doors, even during the day. I installed cameras around the property. Jason tried to be more clever. He sent me a letter, no return address, filled with fake legal threats, demanding I return the inheritance before he took further action. Lynn, meanwhile, played the sympathy card. She called from a block number, voice trembling with fake emotion, saying she understood why Dad liked me, but begging me to do the right thing and think about the family. Family. They loved that word when it suited them. I didn't respond. I didn't owe them anything. Not explanations, not apologies, and certainly not the money Walter left me. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't give up easily. People like that, greedy, entitled, rotten to their core, they don't accept loss. They don't accept consequences. They fight, dirty, and so I prepared. Dana and I built a case, so solid it could have been carved out of stone. Every transaction, every text, every voicemail was cataloged and dated. Every threat they sent me became a nail in their own coffin. 2 months later, we had our first preliminary court hearing. I sat in the front row, wearing my best suit, calm on the outside but burning inside. Greg was there, scowling so hard I thought his face might crack. Jason couldn't even look at me. Lynn tried to look sad, but the flicker of rage in her eyes gave her away. Their lawyer, some overworked, underprepared guy probably hired out of desperation, stumbled through the opening arguments like he hadn't even read the file. Dana, meanwhile, dismantled their claims piece by piece, voice clear and sharp enough to cut steel. When she finished, the judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Given the evidence provided, he said slowly, this court sees no basis for the plaintiff's claims. Furthermore, there appears to be substantial harassment toward the defendant. He paused, letting the words sink in. I strongly advise the plaintiffs to consider withdrawing before sanctions are imposed. Greg exploded, shouting something about conspiracies, and this isn't over, but the judge just pounded his gavel once, sharp and final. Hearing adjourned. Outside the courthouse, they surrounded me. Greg shouting. Jason throwing wild accusations. Lynn crying angry, frustrated tears. I didn't say a word. Didn't flinch. Didn't blink. I just walked past them, head high, like Walter would have wanted. They weren't my problem anymore. But I wasn't done yet, because if they thought they could walk away clean after trying to tear my life apart, they were about to learn a hard, expensive
Winning
lesson.
in court wasn't enough
The real
for me.
payback hadn't
Maybe
even
it should have
started.
been.
Maybe Walter would have wanted me to let it go, to walk away with my head held high. But after everything they tried to pull, the threats, the harassment, the way they smeared his memory to claw at his money, I couldn't just leave it there. They needed to understand. Actions have consequences. I started quietly. First, I hired a private investigator, a real professional, the kind of guy you never see coming. It didn't take long to dig up their financial situations. Greg was drowning in debt, keeping up appearances with payday loans and a second mortgage he could barely afford. Jason had 2 DUIs and was working a dead-end job at a construction site, paycheck to paycheck. Lynn was the most stable, but even she was sitting on mountains of credit card debt, shopping her way into bankruptcy. They were desperate when Walter died, and even more desperate now after losing the inheritance they thought was theirs by birthright. Perfect. Meanwhile, Dana helped me file a countersuit, not just for harassment, but for defamation and emotional distress. Every voicemail, every text, every veiled threat became a bullet in my legal gun. They scoffed at first, thinking I was bluffing, until the court summons landed on their doorstep, until they realized they were being sued for triple damages, until they realized they couldn't afford a decent lawyer this time. Greg tried to sell his truck to pay his legal fees. Jason begged his friends for money, but nobody was eager to get involved. Lynn actually started a GoFundMe, spinning some sob story about unfair treatment and being robbed of her rightful legacy. It didn't even raise enough for a decent meal, let alone a defense. At the next hearing, they looked like ghosts of themselves, pale, jittery, hollow-eyed. Their cheap suits hung off their frames like scarecrows. And when the judge ruled in my favor again, awarding me an additional $75,000 in damages, they broke completely. Greg punched the wall so hard the bailiff had to intervene. Jason stormed out of the courtroom, cursing everyone in sight. Lynn just sat there, head bowed, shoulders shaking silently. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. But then I remembered the nights I couldn't sleep because of their threats. The way they tried to rip apart what little piece Walter had left in his final days. No, they deserved everything that was happening. In the weeks that followed, things got even worse for them. Wage garnishments were filed. Liens were placed on their property. Their credit scores nosedived into the gutter. Greg lost his house. Jason was arrested again. Another DUI. Lynn had to move back into a cramped apartment with her 2 kids, struggling to make ends meet. I didn't touch a single cent of the damages they were ordered to pay me. Instead, I set aside in a separate account, one earmarked for a charity Walter used to talk about, a foundation that provided palliative care to terminal patients who couldn't afford it. In the end, their cruelty funded something good, something Walter would have smiled at. Poetic, really. One afternoon, months after everything had settled, I found myself standing outside the bar where it all started. The same place where I met Walter that rainy night. It looked smaller now, quieter. I went inside and sat at the bar, ordering a whiskey, not to celebrate, not to gloat, just to remember, to honor the man who gave me a second chance, not just with money, but with purpose. Walter didn't leave me $400,000. He left me a lesson about kindness, about loyalty, about standing up when it matters. I raised my glass to the empty seat beside me. Thanks, Walter, I said quietly. Hope I made you proud. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Not because I had won, but because I had finished the story the right way. On my terms. A year later, I barely recognized the life I was living. The money Walter left me still sat untouched in my investment account, growing steadily. A reminder that good fortune, when earned right, doesn't burn holes in your pockets. I hadn't quit my job or bought a flashy car. I hadn't moved to some exotic city or tried to reinvent myself. Instead, I quietly sponsored 3 patients through Walter's favorite hospice foundation, covering their treatments, their comfort, their dignity. It felt right. It felt like honoring a promise I never actually made, but always knew I would keep. As for Walter's family, I heard through the grapevine that Greg was driving trucks cross-country, barely scraping by. Jason moved in with a distant cousin in another state. Lynn remarried quickly, but even her new husband couldn't save her from the debt she dragged behind her like a ball and chain. They had forgotten Walter long before he left this world. I never did. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about that rainy evening, about the tired old man sitting alone at a bar, waiting for someone, anyone, to care enough to ask if he was okay. I hadn't done it for a reward. I hadn't done it expecting anything. And maybe that's why it mattered. Because the real inheritance Walter gave me wasn't money. It was a reminder that kindness in a world full of indifference is a form of rebellion. That loyalty still matters. That a good heart still has power, even if no one's watching. Especially then,